Picture this. The spring brake is supposed to be the one moment in the Formula One calendar where the pressure valve releases, where drivers disappear to their yachts and holiday homes and the paddock finally goes quiet. But somewhere behind the locked gates of a private Ferrari facility in northern Italy, a 7-time world champion is strapping himself into the SF26 and driving it through a man-made downpour on a track barely long enough to call a circuit. 142 laps on day one alone, 423 kilometers, on a strip of tarmac stretching less than 3 kilometers from one end to the other. And then, just when you think this is simply a story about a driver working hard during a holiday, Pirelli did something that almost never happens. They looked at the reserve driver penciled in for day 2 and picked up the phone and asked for Hamilton again. Because what he was giving them from inside that cockpit was something so clean and so consistent that nobody else could replace it. And buried underneath all of that is a question every rival team should be deeply uncomfortable with. Because what exactly does a driver carry home in his body after nearly 300 laps of wet weather in a car his own engineers were not even allowed to study? To understand why those laps matter so much, you have to go back 3 months. Because 3 months ago, Hamilton had never once pulled on a red race suit and stood on a Formula One grid as a Ferrari driver. And the SF26 waiting for him was not simply a faster version of something he already understood. It was a machine built on a completely different philosophy that sat in direct conflict with every instinct 11 years inside a Mercedes had carved into his driving style. And the ghost sitting over all of that was his 2025 season. 0 podiums across an entire year, career worst numbers by every measure. A points tally that did not reflect the driver. The world spent 2 decades watching dominate the sport, and the question the paddock was quietly asking was whether the fire was still there or whether 2025 had taken something from him that a change of team could not give back. And 3 races into this Ferrari chapter, the answer is forming. 1 podium in China, 41 championship points, a momentum still fragile but pointing in one direction. Yet the real problem was never talent, it was comfort. The deep bone-level familiarity with a machine that only comes from hundreds of laps until the car stops, surprising you and starts feeling like an extension of your own nervous system. And comfort cannot be simulated or briefed into a driver before a qualifying session. It has to be earned the slow way, 1 lap at a time. And the place where those laps were earned is not just any test track, because in 1972, Enzo Ferrari had simply had enough of travelling to circuits where other eyes could watch, so he built his own, a private circuit tucked directly behind the factory gates in Maranello, and he placed his personal house at the figure of 8 crossing at the heart of it, meaning that at 3 in the morning, if a Ferrari engine sounded slightly wrong, Enzo knew before the engineers picked up their clipboards. And the corners at Fiorano are recreations of the most demanding turns in Formula One history. Tarzan from Zandvoort, Brunchen from the Nürburgring, Larascas from Monaco. And when Schumacher arrived in 1996, he had the first 3 corners rebuilt to his own specifications. His lap record of 55.99 seconds set in the legendary F2004 still stands more than 2 decades later. And in 2008, Ferrari added underground rain tanks capable of flooding the entire circuit on demand, meaning Ferrari does not wait for rain, Ferrari makes its own rain, on its own track, behind its own gates, and it was inside this place, sealed from the outside world, that Hamilton was about to spend 2 days learning something about the SF26 that no simulator could ever teach him. April 9th arrived with clear skies and 21 degrees of warm sunshine. And then Ferrari turned on the sprinklers, and within minutes, a bone-dry circuit became a controlled downpour, and Hamilton was already pushing, working through multiple full-wet compound builds Pirelli is developing for the 2027 tyre range. And then the afternoon shifted to intermediate testing. And this is where the real value begins to stack up, because the switch between full-wet tyres and intermediates is one of the most consequential calls in the entire sport. Get it right, and you gain 2 to 3 seconds per lap over every rival still running full wets on a track that no longer needs them. Get it wrong, and you are sliding backwards through the field on cold tyres that never find their grip window. And Hamilton spent an entire afternoon living inside exactly that switch zone in the SF26. mapping where the car transitions from being held by the tyre to being at the mercy of the water. And then he ran wide into the gravel, picked up grass and dirt across his tyres, got the car back on track and kept pushing without lifting. And that single moment tells you more about where his head is right now than any lap time or any interview ever could. Day 2 brought the decision nobody anticipated, because Pirelli looked at what Hamilton had given them on day 1 and asked Ferrari to keep him in the seat for the entirety of day 2 as well, passing over the reserve driver entirely. And the reason was precise. Different drivers feel different things and prioritise different things. And when you are comparing tyre compounds tested hours apart, you cannot afford a moving human variable. So Hamilton became their fixed reference point across all 297 laps, and he delivered 155 laps on day 2, 461 more kilometres, best time dropping to 1 minute 0.740 seconds, while Leclerc sat in the simulator at Maranello building Ferrari's Miami aerodynamic package, one driver accumulating real-world wet weather knowledge, while the other built virtual aerodynamics for a pressing upgrade deadline. Ferrari dividing its two most important resources with the cold precision of a team that has already decided this championship will not be won on a dry Saturday afternoon. Now here is the part Ferrari's rivals would prefer you did not think too hard about. Because on paper, Ferrari got absolutely nothing from those 2 days. Every tyre temperature, every pressure log, every sensor trace belongs entirely to Pirelli. Ferrari's engineers cannot open a single file. And if you stopped the story there, it would look like a neutral exchange with no lasting consequence. But stopping there would be like watching a master locksmith spend 2 days studying a vault and concluding nothing happened because he did not take any money. Because no rulebook can legislate against what a driver's body learns through 297 laps of the same demanding physical experience repeated over and over. Hamilton came home not with data but with instinct. And instinct lives in your hands and your feet and the base of your spine and fires before your conscious mind has registered that anything has changed. He learned how the rear of the SF26 snaps under early throttle through standing water, how the energy recovery system fights for traction in real time, how the active aerodynamics shifts the car's balance through spray at speed, and none of that exists in any file a rival team could ever access. It is burned into his nervous system permanently, and the SF26 he drove through that Fiorano rain is far closer to the car he will race in Miami than the rough Barcelona prototype he briefly experienced in wet conditions back in January. Which means if rain arrives at any circuit for the rest of this season, Hamilton will not be feeling his way through an unfamiliar situation. He will be drawing on nearly 300 laps of specific wet weather knowledge in the exact machine he is racing. And that is the hidden advantage that will never appear on any timing sheet. Ferrari's championship position adds real urgency to all of this, because Mercedes have dominated from race 1. Kimi Antonelli has 2 wins, George Russell has 1, and the Silver Arrows sit on 135 constructor points to Ferrari's 90. And while Ferrari have stood on the podium at every round, they have not once genuinely threatened to take a victory, hamstrung by a 20 to 25 brake horsepower engine deficit that turns every long straight into a reminder of where the SF26 still falls short. And McLaren are closing from behind, with Oscar Piastri's Japan results signalling they are finding their rhythm, meaning Ferrari is fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, and the window to position themselves as a real title threat rather than an organised runner-up is shrinking race by race, which is exactly why Miami carries so much weight. It is because Ferrari are bringing the most significant upgrade package of the season so far, a reworked floor for more downforce without added drag, aerodynamic refinements across multiple body surfaces, cooling upgrades essential in Florida's heat and humidity, and most importantly, new engine software specifically targeting the super clipping effect that has been silently bleeding straight line speed all season, and the SF26's active rear wing system, nicknamed the Macarena because its upper element flips completely upside down at high speed, will face its most demanding test yet on Miami's 3 long straights, and a filming day at Monza on April 22nd gives both drivers a final chance to validate the upgrades before the freight ships to Florida. With a longer-term, FIA-approved engine development path potentially worth 30 additional brake horsepower by mid-season, making the 45-point gap to Mercedes look less like a final answer and more like an opening chapter. And while Hamilton was grinding through artificial rain at Fiorano, Max Verstappen spent his spring break GT3 racing at the Nürburgring, qualifying on pole by 1.9 seconds before a tyre breach wiped the result. And the Nürburgring, the 24 hours commitment on May 14th, sits just 2 weeks after Miami. A scheduling choice that is impossible to fully separate from the growing frustration Verstappen has been expressing about the 2026 regulations, calling the energy management side something that feels like a video game, and his Red Bull contract runs through 2028, but he has repeatedly refused to confirm he will see it through, while Hamilton, after Japan, sat at the opposite end of that conversation entirely, because from where he stands, the 2026 rules have delivered exactly what racing should look like: more genuine overtaking, richer tactical decisions, lighter, more responsive cars that feel closer to go-karts than anything in recent memory. And the SF26 carries traces of his own thinking from the time he spent shaping its design philosophy before it was even built. So what you are looking at when you hold these two pictures side by side is two of the greatest drivers the sport has ever seen sitting on opposite sides of a question about what Formula One is actually worth. One grinding laps through fake rain because every kilometre makes him more ready, the other being pulled in more than one direction at the same time. And championships across the longest season are decided by whoever wants it most consistently. And right now, those two things are not pointing in the same direction for both of them. So come back to where this story started. 884 kilometres, 297 laps, a circuit barely 3 kilometres long, none of it on any Ferrari data log, not one tyre temperature, not one pressure trace, not one sensor reading that their engineers can legally touch. And yet, the idea that Ferrari gained nothing from those 2 days borders on fiction, because what the rulebook measures and what actually happened at Fiorano are separated by the one gap no regulation has ever closed: the gap between data and feel, between what a computer records and what a human body learns when pushed through the same physical experience nearly 300 times. And Ferrari's 5-week break was never a break. It was Fiorano, the simulator running deep into the night, the Monza filming day, factory work around the clock at Maranello, and the team that fills every free hour with preparation rather than rest is the team that will still be standing when the championship reaches its final chapters. So go back to that image. One last time, Hamilton alone in the rain on a private 3-kilometre track, with no crowd and no cameras and no rivals watching, pushing harder than the day required. And ask yourself why a driver with nothing left to prove chooses to spend his holiday doing that. Because the answer is the same answer it has always been for people who reach the very top and then refuse to stop climbing. And if the rest of the grid was not paying attention to what happened behind those Fiorano gates, they should probably start now.